Friday the 12th of November. This is the Climate Alarm Clock. This week's main stories: we've all the latest from COP26, we look at what's in the Climate Action Plan, and where does Ireland rank in the 2021 Climate Change Performance Index. Also coming up on this week's show, Anna has the final part of our Mean Bog story, we continue our collaboration with Irish Doctors for Environment, Ceire gets some sustainability tips from the Useless Project, and we chat to Kaylee Crossan live from COP26. Hello and welcome to the Climate Alarm Clock, your weekly Irish climate news podcast. I'm Darragh. COP26 is all but finished now, and we'll be giving that quite a lot of focus this week, but the climate story is far bigger than one conference, and as usual we have a great mix of climate features. As always, we start with the news, and I'm joined by Ciara Tiernan and Anna Pringle today. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, Darragh.
All good, Darragh, thanks.
Yeah, so we'll be starting with COP26, and at the moment it kind of feels like there's two COPs going on almost.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be over in Glasgow last weekend. I wasn't inside the COP, but outside of the COP, on the streets in the protests, there was amazing energy, real drive for change and climate justice, which was very inspiring. But seems like inside the COP, a different story has been going on.
Yeah, I think there isn't that real realization of how bad things are, how much change we need. And so even last week we reported that a study had been done that if all the commitments were met from this COP, which is a big if, that warming will be reduced to 1.9 degrees. But then the Climate Action Tracker have come out, and their study suggests that it will be 2.4 degrees of warming even if we meet these targets. And that really shows the sort of disconnect between what needs to happen and what is happening and the narrative that's going with that. And I think that's summed up probably quite well in the draft agreement for the conference, Anna.
Yeah, now this may be out of date because it changes daily, but there was a decision published on the 10th, so a couple of days ago, the draft so-called decision from the COP, and I looked hard to find an actual decision in it, and there was nothing that struck me as a decision, but lots of waffle language, really.
And what is the draft agreement exactly?
So they, after every COP, they publish an agreement or a decision that's reached by the COP. So, for example, in Paris, the Paris Agreement was obviously the decision there. So this sort of sums up what the outputs, the official outputs from the COP are. So it's in categories like science, adaptation, finance, mitigation. And it has a lot of, noting things, emphasizing, recognizing, notes with serious concern the findings from the IPCC report. Yeah.
So if this was going to be a strong agreement, it would have a lot of sort of obligatory language where it's saying that the parties, the countries will do this, shall do this, where it's more like have regard to this kind of stuff.
I mean,
so it's weak language.
They stress the urgency of increased ambition. They express alarm and concern. The only thing in there that is maybe a little stronger than usual is it calls upon parties to accelerate the phasing out of coal and subsidies for fossil fuels. That is the only mention of fossil fuels in the document. And there was some discussion after it that may come out in the negotiations. So we'll have to wait and see what the final document is.
So as you're listening to this, it might have been taken out. And I think then, that draft agreement kind of points to a bit of a leadership crisis within the COP.
Yeah, one of the things, Darragh, that struck me about COP is that leadership theme. And as Ciara was just saying, you're seeing young people and activists and NGOs showing a lot of leadership and energy, but we're not seeing the same thing from the so-called world leaders who are showing up there. And Obama coming on Monday was just one example of that. And he still seems to have superstar status and people applaud him and so on. But he actually stood on stage and basically told young people to stop sulking.
Yeah, I mean, that was a little bit cringy, to be honest. Obama, while he was in power, the fossil fuel industry was booming in the States. Fracking
took off while he was in power.
And I mean, we won't even go down there, but a nice caveat to Barack Obama was our very own Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland and chief elder to the United Nations. And she gave a very moving speech about the urgency of taking action and called out countries like Australia, Saudi Arabia on what they need to do and their responsibility to the climate and the environment.
But it's also the passion that she showed and the emotion. And I mean, one of the comments afterwards was from Tara Shine was that it would be great if we had more male leaders showing similar levels of emotion and passion, since they're the ones with the more power.
Yeah, and if they're not able to show emotion and passion, pass the mic. It's true.
Yes, as we say, bleep the patriarchy.
Absolutely, that's it.
And so I suppose on the topic of leadership and climate action, we said last week we're going to do a deep dive into the climate action plan. And actually there's so much in it that we're going to take a little bit from the climate action plan every week for the next 3 weeks. So I suppose initial reactions from me to the climate action plan is that it's a big step up in terms of the soft measures compared to the last climate action plan. So the original climate action plan only had mentions of a just transition and engagement in education, sort of tacked on as a chapter at the end. Now in this new version, there's 2 chapters on just transition and a chapter on engagement, and they're upfront. And they're upfront. So that is a pretty positive development. So we will be getting into more depth about different aspects of the climate action plan next week and the week after. But for now, we're going to focus on transport. So Ciara, what's in there with regard to transport, the good and the bad?
Yeah, so there are good and bad with regards to transport in the plan. Starting with the good, I was happy to see the Safe Routes to School programme was launched this year, and that supports walking, scooting and cycling to school in primary and post-primary schools, which is good for children, good for the environment, more pedestrianised areas, more traffic-free zones, improves planetary health and human health, and reduces the risk of accidents on roads, all that good stuff. Some kind of questionable news this week or something kind of disappointing that was in the news this week is that for an additional time, the Dart Underground project has been shelved for at least 20 years following the review from the National Transport Authority. Now, I would say we don't have 20 years to wait for increased rail transport options. And
Metro North has gone away again, I think, too, hasn't it? Or been delayed again?
Yeah. And it just seems like the priorities are a bit out of whack because there's €100 million of funding going to e-vehicles, which excludes cargo bikes, excludes electric bikes, and is basically exclusively devoted to cars. By 2030, we hope to have 845,000 electric vehicles on the road. Those are privately owned vehicles, and at the same time, only 1,500 public electric vehicles.
Well, that's down from 1 million EVs.
I mean,
and at least there is a little bit of a shift in emphasis in that they're talking about increasing the proportion of kilometres driven by EVs to between 40 and 45%, as opposed to getting to 1 million cars on the road. But either way, it's still too many cars on the road.
Yeah, so it is a step change in the right direction in terms of the EVs, but we do need to see a modal shift away from car usage, really. And something to say about the Climate Action Plan in general is that it is updated every year. So hopefully year on year we see increased ambition, we see increased moves for kind of more systemic changes. And with our Climate Action Plan being announced, you would think that in the latest Climate Change Performance Index, we would be doing very well.
So first of all, what is the Climate Change Performance Index?
Yeah, the Climate Change Performance Index is a study run by German Watch where they evaluate 60 countries looking at climate change performance based on greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy, energy use and climate policy. And Ireland, despite our new climate action plan, has dropped 7 places from 39th to 46th. And the big reason for that is because our emissions are so high.
No.
Well, you see, this is where you get the gap between plans and strategies and reality. So our emissions are still very high. And in fact, even this week, Niall Sargent was talking about how Ireland is ranked 7th worst out of 28 EU member states in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions. So think about that for a minute. We're by no means one of the biggest EU states, but we have one of the biggest greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look at it per capita, it's even worse.
And just finally, another reason that we were ranked so low is that we should be endeavouring to reach net zero emissions before 2050 in order to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and do our fair share as a developed country. And before we leave the newsroom, Anna, what's our not climate story this week?
Okay, so our not climate news story this week is about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Eternals film, which came out, I think, in the last week or so. Not too great reviews, I'd have to say. But the connection is that Dr. Martin Worthington of Trinity College supplied them with the Babylonian language for using in the film. Partly some of it is set in ancient Babylon, and he provided the language. So he was on media this week, and he's delighted with himself because I guess it's not often that a Mesopotamian scholar, I can't even say that, is in, a massive blockbuster. So he provided the language for it.
And what has that got to do with the climate?
Well, I think it's an interesting one because if you think about Babylon, it was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and is a massive civilization and a very sophisticated city. And all that's left of it now is a few ruins somewhere in Iraq. And that whole civilization has died out. And one of the reasons that scholars think it died out is partly because of drought and climate change.
Okay.
So it can happen,
Ooh. Yeah, that's chilling.
Yeah, and also the fact that it was a revived language, I think it says a lot about the impacts that climate change can have on culture and culture disappearing, and that's not mentioned in the draft agreement of the of COP26. It's not mentioned in our climate action plan, but it's one of these invisible impacts that we don't see. That's already happening around the world.
Yeah, but it does really reinforce the need for conversation and for engaging communities. And actually, we had Mark Foley from AirGrid this week. He was talking about, we have the technology, we have the engineering to upgrade our grid, but we need to bring people along with us, and having those conversations with communities is so important. And that's it from all of us at the newsroom for this week. Coming up next, we continue our collaboration with Irish Doctors for the Environment with Dr. Ceire Lee.
Also still to come on the Climate Alarm Clock, we chat to Kaylee Crossan live at COP26. Ciara will be back a little later on with the event guide. Cara chats to Taz and Geraldine from the Useless Project. And Anna will be back with the final part of the Mean Bog story. But first, we're continuing our collaboration with Irish Doctors for the Environment. I spoke to Dr. Ceire Lee this week, and I started off by asking her to introduce herself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a million, Darragh, and everyone at the podcast for having me on. So I work as a doctor in obstetrics and gynecology, and I'm currently working in the Coombe Hospital. So that's kind of where my main interest is the overlap between planetary health and sexual and reproductive health.
Yeah, and this is quite a big topic. So I know we're not going to get into all of it in this little interview, Ceire. So we're going to look at a few areas, and the first thing I think that you're going to tell us about is maternal health and pregnancy. So what are the links between the environment and climate change?
So this is actually a really interesting and a really kind of growing area, the link between the climate crisis and pregnancy. Certainly one that there's been a lot of studies on recently is air pollution. It's been linked to things like preterm birth, growth restriction of the baby, pregnancy, diabetes, and high blood pressure. There's been a couple of studies over the last few years that have looked at placentas, which is the organ that provides nutrients and oxygen to the baby when they're in the womb. and have found evidence of air pollutants such as fine particulate matter and black carbon on the placenta. So that's evidence that these pollutants are reaching this organ. And obviously then you have to think about the implications of whether or not the baby is affected from this. We also have seen studies that have looked at rising temperatures and linked it to things like preterm birth and even cardiac defects or problems with the baby's heart when they're in the womb. There's also kind of links to, natural disasters and then the complications of migration that are associated with that. So when mums have to move, there's links to mental health problems as well as all the other kind of complications that I've already discussed. So a really important area for all of us working in this speciality.
And then the last area you're going to discuss, Sive, is around the environmental impact of breastfeeding versus bottle feeding.
Yeah, and this can be a very sensitive topic and a slightly controversial topic. So first of all, I want to say it's not at all, if there's anybody listening out there who's chosen to bottle feed, there's no guilt or shame or blame to be associated with it, because breastfeeding doesn't work for every mum. But it is an area that we don't always consider as something that can affect the climate. Formula feeding is an industry, and with an industry, there's a huge amount of emissions associated with it. So whether that's from the processing or the transport, the fossil fuels that they use to do that. And then there's also additives, sometimes like palm oil, which we're all pretty aware of the climate impact of. And then there's the waste side of it. In 2009, there was a study done that showed 550 million formula cans were added to landfill each year. Also, a recent study just last month in Ireland, you actually pointed this one out, Darragh, as well, looking at if we in Ireland changed or increased our breastfeeding rate, because we have one of the lowest in Europe and one of the lowest in the world, which is pretty shocking and something that we could really improve on. But if we did increase our breastfeeding rate to the minimum recommended by the WHO, which is 50%, versus if the formula industry went to renewable fuel sources, still increasing our breastfeeding would have a better impact on the climate. And also, breast is best for baby and breast is best for mum. So I think that all of us who are working in the sector just need to be conscious of it and try to really support women and help with kind of initiatives that are trying to improve breastfeeding rates in the country.
That was Dr. Sive Lee, and we'll be releasing that full interview where we hear more about the links between climate and reproductive and sexual health. And you can also hear more from Sive this week at an IDE webinar. And to find out more about this event and many other events, we're going to hand back to Ceire Tiernan with the Irish Enviro Event Guide.
Hello and welcome to the Irish Enviro Event Guide. As usual, there are lots of great events taking place throughout the country and online. So here are some of the highlights for this week, the 15th to the 21st of November. Starting with online events, Engineers Without Borders Ireland are hosting a webinar on the transformative potential of community-led housing as part of their Reimagining Sustainable Development series. It's taking place on Wednesday the 17th at 1:30 p.m. Register through the Engineers Without Borders website. If you've enjoyed our collaboration with Irish Doctors for the Environment, check out their webinar with the Irish Global Health Network on Thursday the 18th at 1:30 p.m. The event, which discusses climate change implications for health and the healthcare system, hears from doctors who have devoted their work to environmental issues. You can register through globalhealth.ie. The webinar is also being moderated by the very inspiring Dr. Sive Lee, who I loved hearing from on this week's episode. For the listeners interested in attending in-person events, there are plenty of opportunities to get involved. So for our business friends up north, the Innovation Factory Belfast are hosting the Business of Net Zero on Thursday the 18th from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Designed for small and medium enterprises, this workshop explores practical examples of emissions reduction strategies and how to begin to adapt your business plan for a zero carbon future. Register through eventbrite.ie. Shout out to my creative types in West Dublin. You can join writer Nell Regan for a poetry workshop in Lucan Library, looking at how to convey the mood of a season in a few words. You will embark on some writing exercises during the session and make up your own weather and winter related poems. This event takes place on Thursday the 18th at 6:30 p.m. Register through Eventbrite.ie. The National Youth Council of Ireland are hosting a workshop, Youth Ideas to Global Action, on Saturday the 20th from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. This event takes place in Dublin and is designed for young people between the ages of 16 to 30 who want to be involved in shaping our future. The workshop will explore global citizenship and ideas for positive change. There are 40 spaces, so spread the word to any young climate activists you know. Participants will leave with a deck of youth empowerment cards and a One World Week resource pack. Register through youth.ie. That's it for this week's events. You can find links to the mentioned events in the description of this episode, and be sure to follow us on social media for details of these and additional unmentioned events. If you know of any events taking place, get in touch with us at climatealarmclock@gmail.com.
That was the Irish Enviro Event Guide, and if you want to follow us on social media as Ciara suggested, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Climate Alarm Clock and on Twitter at The Climate Alarm. If you like what we do, please subscribe and review the podcast, and be sure to recommend us to a friend. Now we're returning to COP26. I spoke to Kaylee Crossan, who is in Glasgow, and I started by asking her to introduce herself and tell us about her experience of COP so far.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kaylee Crossan. I'm the editor of The Green News, and I've been a climate reporter for 3 years. So I'm here at COP26 covering protests mainly. It's been a really interesting experience. Each day is kind of a different set of protests addressing different issues within the climate crisis. For example, yesterday there was a group of indigenous people from Brazil who were standing outside the entrance to the venue itself, and they were hosting a protest and basically explaining what it's like to be on the front line of the climate crisis. And that's not something that really you experience as a climate journalist unless you're in a country on the front lines. So it's been really an incredible experience, to put it mildly and inadequately.
It seems from seeing the footage, it just seems to have been, a really, like any of the protests we've had here, but times 100 in terms of the emotion and stuff. What has sort of your emotional reaction been to being amongst those protests and amongst those people?
That's a great question. So, like I said earlier, I have been a climate reporter for 3 years, and I remember one of the first really, really big protests in Dublin was in March 2019. And there were, I believe if I have the figure right, 15,000 students that were taking part in this action. And I remember walking down kind of the main street leading up to the Dáil, and there was just kind of like this wall of sound. And I've been at other protests with a huge amount of people, but I hadn't had that experience of like hearing a chant kind of ripple from the back of a crowd and go all the way up to the front until this week. I got lucky enough to hear it twice, 2 days in a row. So I'm sure as many of your listeners are probably very interested in all things climate news related. There was a international Fridays for Future strike on the first week of COP. So that was the Friday. And that was about 25,000 people. So it was a similar experience of like snaking around different streets in the city center. And I think for me, a moment that was very emotional and one that's going to stick with me, hopefully throughout the rest of my career, is myself and a couple of other reporters were walking alongside the march, or we were getting out in front to see what pictures we could get. And as we got closer to George Square, where the rally was going to be held, we kind of hopped up on higher elevation, like in these buildings kind of had little juts of things that you could stand on. And when you have that vantage point, that perspective, to just see reams of thousands of people coming down a street, and we were like on elevation, so you could just see like literally thousands of people with signs of all sorts, people from all over the world demanding climate justice. It was, I don't think I could ever adequately put it actually into words. It was really incredible. And similarly, on the next day, on the Saturday, there was over 100,000 people. So actually, I went to the same spot that I went to on that Friday to kind of get that same vantage point. And each time it was just completely jaw-dropping and awe-inspiring.
Yeah, I bet. It sounds amazing. Do you think those protests are having an impact on the proceedings inside in COP26?
So we're recording this before the final outcome of COP is out. So I think the real verdict is going to be what's in that final document. So I think at the moment it's kind of difficult to tell. I was speaking earlier today to Conor O'Neill, who is the policy officer at Christian Aid for Story, and he was saying that, in his opinion, the draft document that he's seen so far doesn't capture what people are calling for on the streets. So I think as it stands right now, there's a lot of commentators saying that what is going on within the building itself and the document that's being produced right now isn't matching the ambition that we're seeing with protesters. So I think the final document is where we're going to be able to tell if that ambition was matched. I've been thinking quite a lot about these protests over the past 10 days because I go out and cover them every day. I think one thing that's really stood out to me about these protests and what I'm trying to highlight in some of the reporting I've been doing is that we're really seeing an intersectional link. I know sometimes people say that word might be overused, but truly, like, the protests, the participants in them, the issues that are being brought up at rallies are really demonstrating how interlinked these issues really are. For example, on Saturday, when I was walking along the march at one point, we saw groups of migrant rights organizations. We saw a lot of trade unions. It was really like to see all these different societal movements come together under one umbrella is something I personally in my career have not seen. So that's something that I think is being reported on and being covered and photographed. And I think that's shaping the public narrative to see the kind of solidarity that's building across these movements in a way that personally I haven't seen before.
And before you go, I know the concept of climate grief is something that you think we should discuss much more. And there's an essay Mary Hegler wrote this week that really resonated with you, which I'll share in the show notes. We actually talked about the emotion in Mary Robinson's interview during the week, and it can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people who are either working on the issue or reporting on the issue hold themselves to this standard of like emotional objectivity. But you're a person. And at the end of the day, the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, of course, is about like all life on the planet, but it's also about humanity. It's a human story. And seeing and hearing about that much suffering, of course, is going to have an emotional toll. So taking the space to recognize like the existential weight of it. And I've been trying to do that while I've been here, to just recognize moments where it has been very intense. And, you know, you can, of course, like, people even who do this full time have moments of despair around this, and being able to hold that space rather than trying to push through it is something that Mary Hegler writes beautifully about and has for a long time. So really can highly recommend to go and have a read of that essay.
That was Kaylee Crossan, and if you would like to hear more from Kaylee, be sure to check out greennews.ie. Coming up a little later on the Climate Alarm Clock podcast, Anna finishes off her 4-part feature on Mean Bog. But now we're continuing our collaboration with Book of Leaves podcast, where Cara was chatting to Taz and Geraldine from the Useless Project.
Hi guys, so this week I'm going to share a snippet of episode 39 of Book of Leaves, in which I interviewed 2 absolute positive legends in the sustainable scene in Ireland, which are Geraldine and Taz of the Useless Project. If you do not know about Geraldine and Taz, well, you are welcome. These 2 people are just bursting balls of positive energy. They have an Instagram account which you can follow at The Useless Project, and they share so many really useful information and slides. They host flea markets and much, much more. So absolutely check them out. And here is Taz sharing lots of leaves in the form of sustainable food decisions and choices that you can make to reduce your personal carbon footprint in your home or in your business if you have a food business. So I hope you enjoy these tips from Taz, of which there are many.
The number one way that we can reduce our carbon impact on the planet, our carbon impact, our water impact, and our energy impact on the planet is the choices that we make around food. So that is the way in which we buy food, the way in which we consume food, the way in which we dispose of food. The number one way that we can reduce our carbon impact on the planet. And it's extremely accessible. It's a very doable thing to do. So a couple of kind of like top tips that I would say, or both of us would say, is like, just try to cut down on your food waste at all possible. 1/3 of all food that's produced goes to waste. 1/3 of all food. So huge amounts of resources go into producing that food that is then going to waste. So we always use the example of like the Amazon rainforest that's being chopped down. So say like it's being chopped down for oil plantations, for palm oil plantations. You have to imagine the deforestation, the orangutans going extinct, etc., etc. All of this being done so we can have palm oil. If 1/3 of that is wasted, then 1/3 of that damage is all done in vain. So if we can chop down on that 1/3, it can make a huge impact, because that's just wasted food. It's not even damage so that we can eat food and get nutrients from it. It's completely wasted. So to cut down on your food waste, there's loads of top tips. Try to batch cook where possible, become friends with your freezer, take note of what's in your fridge before going out and doing another shop. Like a couple of ideas of like having a list on your door of what's in the fridge so you don't go out and buy more apples if you've got apples in there. Also, learn how to actually store stuff in a fridge. So take, for example, the fridge door is actually the warmest part of the whole fridge. So if you're putting your milk in the fridge, which is probably the most perishable item that you have, that is the hottest place it can be. So it's going to go off quicker. Top tip like that as well. And then also try to Then also try to repurpose your scraps. So, if you have little bits of bread left over that are gone stale, make croutons. Or from vegetable peels. Vegetable peels we have decided are waste, but they're part of the vegetable. I don't know why it's not food waste, it's food itself. We have just decided that a carrot peel isn't food, or an onion peel isn't food, or a banana peel isn't food. When the whole thing is food, we've just decided that the outside is waste. So try to look up different kind of top tips on how to repurpose those things, like trying to make a stock out of scraps. And what are the top tips for food?
Eating seasonally. Seasonally. So I only heard this in the last 5 months, and that's by eating seasonally. That's like the easiest way you can reduce your carbon footprint when it comes to food. Well, sorry, probably after waste.
So there you go. If you want to hear more about eating locally or sustainable fashion or Geraldine and Taz's story, tune in to episode 39 of Book of Leaves and make sure you keep up to date with them on Instagram at The Useless Project. Talk to you next week.
Thank you, Cara, and thanks indeed to Taz and Geraldine for the great food waste advice there. Finally, on this week's Climate Alarm Clock, we're handing back to Anna Pringle for the last part of our Mean Bog story.
Have you ever considered the dangers of falling into a bog hole? As a child in Donegal, we were warned that they're bottomless. We'd look into the black water and wonder about that, but we didn't take any chances. I spoke to a woman who was reared on the edge of Mean Bog, and she told me that as kids, they were always warned not to walk over that hill because it was so swampy. Then, she said, Kilcha planted it with forestry. Later, the wind farm was going to put 19 turbines on or near Mean Bog, all but 2 on Quilcha land. When the bog slide happened, the people in the area were devastated, but not surprised. The same woman told me that the day it happened, she was going down past it that morning, and inside her car she could smell the bog. She got out of the car and could hear the rumble of the bog rolling down the stream. She said it was sickening to see it. It kept moving and rumbling all that day. In Ireland, peatlands cover more than 20% of the surface of the country. We have 3 types of bog: raised bogs in the Midlands, low-level Atlantic bog mainly in the west, and high-elevation blanket bog. Dr. Maria Long is a grassland ecologist, and she has a great affinity for blanket bogs.
When you have blanket bog, when you have a living peat, living blanket that's made up mainly of sphagnum moss, so this living moss, it's the same thing that makes up the raised bogs, but they tend to be much more finite. So they make a kind of a dome, and there's a definite edge, whereas the blanket bog peters out into other habitats in various directions. It is more like a blanket, maybe with thinner bits and slightly fatter bits.
Bogs can burst and slide naturally, but forestry and wind farm developments can destabilise the bogs, as Dr. Long explained.
In general, if you have blanket bog or a peaty habitat, if you go digging in roads into that or planting in forestry, you're changing how that functions, and bits of it are drying, and sometimes the drying happens underneath. You don't have to be an ecologist even to get that this peat is a living, wet entity, and if you dry it and damage it and crack it and cut the edges of it, you're going to get drying happening within it, and you're going to have cracks. If you have really strong rainfall events, you can get slippage of a big chunk of it.
Peatlands play an important role in climate change. In their natural state, they sequester more carbon than forests and are second only to oceans in the amount of carbon they store. But when they're drained or degraded, they become a significant source of carbon emissions. Experts here estimate that 85% of Ireland's peatlands are already degraded. So instead of providing us with a natural carbon sink, Ireland's peatlands currently emit about 9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. Who will pay for destroying the carbon sink at Mean Bog? How many tonnes of carbon were emitted by the bog burst? Almost a year to the day since it happened, even though multiple agencies are involved, we still have no reports. I asked Dr. Maria Long about the likely impact of such a bog slide.
It's going to be a very poor secondary habitat if and when it revegetates. It ain't going to be living bog for a very long time, not without significant work, or maybe not ever.
I started this story intrigued by the bog slide in Mean Bog. The more I've looked into wind farm development in Donegal, the more I've come to agree with Dr. Maria Long's conclusion.
The uplands vary, and the deeper the peat and the more integral the peat, the more we definitely should not be doing anything, because that's such a valuable habitat. I think if you asked any self-respecting ecologist, is forestry on peat a good idea? No. And is wind farms on peat a good idea? No.
And yet, wind energy is essential to decarbonise our electricity, and the Climate Action Plan has huge ambition for increasing both onshore and offshore wind. But listening to the communities in Finn Valley and Gibara as they struggle to protect their environment and landscape, as they raise funds locally to fight the deep pockets of what they call big wind, as the hen harriers and golden eagles are threatened and our bogs are destroyed, this leads me to question, is wind energy just another form of extractivism? Wind is renewable, but is large-scale wind production in special landscapes really sustainable? Especially when the communities are not seeing the benefits? If we're choosing to destroy our bogs to allow Amazon data centres to continue to drive economic growth, is that an informed choice that we're making? And who's profiting from that growth? We have a great opportunity here in Ireland. Restoring our bogs to health means they can continue to sequester carbon for centuries, and there could be so many other benefits: cultural, biodiversity, community development, health, and even the emotional benefits of spending time, as poet Patrick Kavanagh put it, round by the glistening bog holes, lost in unthinking joy.
That was Anna Pringle, and if you enjoyed the 4-part feature, we will be releasing it all as a separate standalone piece in the future. That's it for this week's show. As you're listening in to us, COP26 is either finishing up or has already ended. We sincerely hope that the great climate news coverage that has accompanied COP does not end with the conference. One thing is for sure, we'll be back next week and the week after with all our usual features and explainers, and are delighted to announce that we will be back in the new year for a second season of the Climate Alarm Clock, your weekly Irish climate news podcast. Until next week, goodbye.